All right, Sir Rod.
Hello, Sir Gregory.
How are you?
I'm very well, very well.
That's good.
We should have a bit of a talk about your webinar, Greg.
Yeah, we should. You're going to be joined by Miss Lola at some point in here, but that's okay. She's
Okay,
quiet.
there's a good chance that my cat may well make quite a bit of noise as well, and we can see a tail popping up occasionally.
It's all part of the
So
experience.
part of the fun, part of the fun. It actually looks like you're getting kind of like a lordly wave, like
Yeah, well, she knows her place. I've just put her down and she's
yeah.
decided to come back up again. All
Yeah.
right, let's carry on.
One of the things that jumped out at me, Greg, almost straight away when you started the talk was just this idea about the fitness industry compared to the performance industry. And the fact that the fitness industry really does just look at having a workout that just tries to nail you at the end of it. And as you say, it seems to be more geared towards burning calories than actually training for a performance result. And I thought it might be just worth us just having a talk about that, because the noise is so loud, it's very difficult to get the message through that no, training is a process and you're aiming for a long-term performance goal.
Yeah, some years ago I was teaching in the New Zealand mountainside village or city or town of Wanaka, and the host he had a strength and conditioning coaching background, and he was telling me that he had been invited to collaborate on a new business with a colleague or a friend of his. And when they sat down and discussed it further, he decided not to go ahead with it. And the reasons that came out was that his friend who invited him he said to him, listen, our industry is split in two directions. We have an entertainment industry and we have a strength and conditioning performance industry.
Entertainment, I like it.
Yeah. And he was talking about the world of fitness and training, and the entertainment fitness industry is in many ways maybe even bigger than the strength and conditioning and performance training industry. And both of them are required, because here's the interesting thing, they don't need to be mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can make your strength and conditioning on a pathway towards a performance goal entertaining at the same time, the likelihood of...
Just interrupt for a moment there, Greg. Just looking at the supersets, the warm-ups that you did with Rhett, those people look like they're having a lot of fun, which is something that we don't normally associate with performance sports.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you can create an entertaining or a gamified, as Rhett calls it, process, then you're more likely to get people to buy in. And there's this transition, I think, in the personal training world. Early on, you want to make people feel like they walked out of the place better than they walked in. And sometimes that means that you've got to do things to them that give them that dopamine dump. And on occasions, that's related to how hard do I feel like I work today? Did I get value for money in terms of the experience? And then there's this transition point where you say, well, one of your clients might come up to you and say, I'm not sure that I'm getting the result that I wanted with respect to my waistline or my fat percentages, or my 2K running time isn't coming down. And on those occasions, a trainer or a coach or a therapist who's involved in the training probably has to sit down and say, we may need to tighten up your training so that it's not going to feel the same as your initial period, which was really entertaining for you and was engaging in that sense. We may have to do some things that just aren't as comfortable and just aren't as enjoyable as that earlier gamified way. And I think if you set people up for that conversation, they'll probably say, yeah, okay, I think I'm ready to do it now. And what happens is you still gamify it and make it entertaining anyway. Mm-hmm. It's just that you start to shift your stimulus towards much more tight ratios of work and rest. durations, intensities, volumes, loads, and you start measuring it so that you can track the result based on the stimulus. And that doesn't tend to be the case in the entertainment fitness industry, where we're not necessarily tracking a result based on the stimulus we gave you. We're just saying you've got an hour of spin class, okay, and we'll see you the next time you decide to come down to the gym. So
Yeah.
that's really the difference. And it's not derogatory in either way to say that the entertainment fitness industry is not important. It's absolutely important, because, well, it is. I don't think we really need to explain why it's important, because people should be training, they should be working out, they should be exercising for reasons that are so varied, from social reasons to emotional reasons to cardiovascular to economic. But it is different that if you simply just blast people for that benefit, then you're pushing people further away from their readiness for the next training session.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, one thing we know in the entertainment sort of side of the industry, there's massive amounts of burnout. And if you ask yourself the question why, people can't do those high intensity workouts week in, week out, week in, week out for years on end. You can't do that. If you're not cycling around energy systems, if you're not giving people periods of active recovery, they're not going to last. And it doesn't matter how much they enjoy it, they're not going to get the goals they're after. Now, as you know, I'm almost 50, and I train down at a local gym, and I have a bunch of guys just join me who are around the same age as me. And one of the things I say to them is, I say, it's my job to set up the program, so we take you through all of the fundamental movements. We make sure that you have good mobility, good motor control, and you're getting energy system development. But you actually don't need to know about that. No. I'm just going to do that in the background. All you need to do is make sure that you have enough fun that you keep turning up. Yeah. And I often say, like, when you get to our age, the only goal of exercise is to be able to turn up next week. Yeah. So if you come along and you blast yourself week in, week out, and you can get away with that for maybe 8 weeks, and that means you quit, then I actually didn't do my job, and you didn't do yourself any favors. And it's actually, I find, hard to cut through the noise when there's other classes going on before and after us, where people are just going nuts and doing things that are just about entertainment and nothing else. And you would no doubt, I know not the gym you're at, but when you see other gyms, you're probably the same as me, where you look at how these people are moving and you're sort of looking through one slit through your fingers, because it just makes you cringe the whole time. You just know long term these people are going to blow their bodies out and they're not going to last.
Yeah, look, it takes some experience to know when you're close to overtraining. And there's a fine line sometimes between overreaching, which we often want for adaptation, but there's that fine line that takes some experience, and it clearly takes some knowledge. And I guess the purpose of this class was to say, if I could accelerate you 10, 15 or 20 years ahead of your life experience to figure this stuff out, that's what I'd like to do. And the way to cut out all of those hard lessons is to give you some plan that says, if you follow these guidelines, then what will likely happen is that you'll reduce the amount of clients that you have that burn out, because they came closer to recovery rather than being pushed further away. And many clients are on schedules like twice weekly or 3 times weekly or once weekly. And if you're in that higher frequency, like a 2 or a 3 time one-on-one consultation, then you're basically running to a schedule that's not respecting the physiology. You're running to a schedule that respects the calendar.
Your timetable, exactly. Yeah.
And when you don't respect the physiology and you want to provide value for money, it's easy to go down that pathway of blasting the nervous system so the person feels like my trainer's amazing. And so the system there is that look at the primary complex body movements that you're going to be doing for strength, whether that be a power clean, whether that be a bench press or a back squat or kettlebell swing or a deadlift, those big body movements that require many prime movers or large stimulus, if you look at those and then you, as we used in the table, find something complementary to that. If it's a bilateral push, change it to unilateral push, or change it to not an actual dynamic movement, just a hold, or a pull or a press. So anything that's not done in the primary exercise now becomes complementary. And then if you add the second component to it, which is to put the person on the edge of their ability so they can manage their mistakes, you now switch from prime movers, gross motor control, massive high threshold units, to non-prime movers, so segmental stabilizers with prime movers, and low threshold reflex driven motor control that involves breathing as opposed to breath holding. And so by following that system, you suddenly think, well, I don't have to have 10 years experience to figure out the nuances of getting this person just right. It's like, well, if I follow the system, it will allow this person to recover between sets, recover between sessions, so that they can turn up tomorrow if they wanted to. And then you think, holy shit, I can get high volume training out of this, which really, or if I stay on 2 or 3 times a week, my client turns up in 2 days' time based on a calendar schedule, and they say, I feel so ready to go, as opposed to, I'm really beat up from the session on Monday. You must be amazing because I feel horrible.
Yeah.
You know? So it's such a, when you've got this recipe and you think, oh man, I can cut out 20 years of making mistakes. All those people that I lost as clients because they just got beat up and broken. And you and I both know that if you work in an environment where your job is on the line based on the performance of your clients, you can't afford to lose people and break them. You have to have them right on edge and ready to go again this afternoon or tomorrow, whether that's with rugby sevens where you've got a tournament, got multiple games in a day, or whether
and still showing long-term adaptation, whether that's in athletic performance or skill. Either way, you have to be showing that there is some long-term performance gains.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing what you do just for that day.
Yeah, and there was 2 definitions that I gave that relates to a recovery by a superset is really a communication to your nervous system. And what you're saying to the nervous system is, I want you to respond and then adapt to internal and external stimuli. And that's my definition of function, is the ability to respond first and then adapt later. And the second one was, I want you to withstand and overcome adverse conditions. And that's robustness. And that robust definition comes from the Oxford English Dictionary. So if you look up robust, it will say the ability to withstand and overcome adverse conditions. So withstand and overcome is kind of similar to respond and adapt. Adverse conditions, in the robust definition, adverse conditions, is really similar to the stimulus that's coming from externally and internally, the things that push you outside of, balanced homeostasis. So
the process looks like you're choosing one exercise that more or less blasts the nervous system, and then that complementary exercise caresses the nervous system back into a position where it's ready to be blasted again.
Absolutely. And there's real purpose in the language of the definition of function. When we use the word respond and then adapt, that came from a discussion had with Gray Cook back in 2011 in Holland. And he went around the room and he said, what does everyone think should be the definition of function? And a number of people gave a suggestion. And each suggestion was understandably a little bit different from the previous one. Otherwise, there's no point saying, I think it's the same as that person. I think it's the same as that person. Everyone tried to give their little variation or what they thought. And Gray's response was great. He said, yeah, you're all right. But here's the interesting thing. We're a room full of experts and none of us agree. So if none of us agree as a room full of experts, how can we as an industry agree on what functional training looks like or should be? If you can't agree on what the word function means, how could you agree on what functional training is? And in that year, I think 2012, that was 2011, right? So 2012, the NSCA in the US was having a conference or a summit on functional training, and nowhere in their agenda was there any preamble about what functional training was defined as. And so you had multiple experts providing sessions that were supposedly functional training. So, you know, being a bit jet lagged in Holland at the time, I woke up early in the next morning and I was thinking about Gray's question. And what he had said the day before is, I think somewhere in there we need to have a phrase that relates to the ability to adapt. Okay. If you don't have the ability to adapt, I think that's a really important element of being functional. And it became refined later on. Well, I woke up and I thought maybe it's the ability to adapt to internal stimulus and external stimulus. And if you can't adapt to that, then you're not functioning very well. But it got refined later on by saying you have to respond first and your adaptation happens later. So it's a little bit like saying, Rod, you've got a GPS on your motorbike or you've got a GPS in your your VW Golf.
Well, I'm not on at the moment, Greg.
Yeah. So your GPS didn't work awesomely for you because it didn't spot the diesel on the road.
Okay. That's right.
But if you're leaving the Southern Highlands of New South Wales and you want to drive to Melbourne, you know, you want to drive south, and if you don't have a GPS and you head out the road and you start driving north, you've actually responded to your own internal thoughts in the wrong direction. You had an internal thought of, I'm going to drive, and that thought led to an action, which led to a result of you heading in completely the opposite direction to your final destination. If you had a GPS, it would have beeped at you and said, the response that you just gave to your internal thoughts has taken you in the wrong direction. And you would say, oh, I need to change. And the adaptation in this example is you being in Melbourne instead of being in the Southern Highlands. So the long-term result of the actions that you took in driving is you're in Melbourne. Now, if you did not have a response indicator that told you you're going in the wrong direction, then your long-term adaptation result would have been that you probably ended up in Sydney or Brisbane.
That's all right.
Now, we understand that sometimes you go towards the north only to then change direction and then head to the west and then come back down to the south.
Mm-hmm.
We know that you do that because it is actually the most efficient pathway, even though it's not the most direct initially.
Mm-hmm.
So that with that analogy in mind, we know that if you want long-term adaptation like hypertrophy or cross-sectional area in myofibrils,
mm-hmm.
or pure recognizable and measurable force outputs, like a maximum effort bench press, for example, and you're a front row rugby player and you need to meet 150 kilograms to make the first grade senior team, then that adaptation has to be something that's going to come down the track. And so your training sessions are probably going to be genuinely pushing you to feel delayed onset muscle soreness the next day, because that breakdown is necessary. So you take a slightly less efficient approach by feeling sore and losing mobility and having a nervous system that's blasted, but you know that that will get you the result that you want. But what it might do is hurt your ability to move very well for the next training session if you're in a high volume program that's going to require you to train tomorrow. And so it's got to be one of those things where you balance up, I do need to get some DOMs, I do need to really exert and blast my nervous system, because otherwise I'm not going to be in this game. I won't make the side if I don't get 150 kilo bench press, and so I've got to get that hurt. But you've also got to turn up to training tomorrow and not break down, because no person with 150 kilogram bench press who is injured and sitting on the bench is as good a player as one who's got 140 kilogram bench press who's not injured.
Yep.
So is that fine balance between, I do need to get a longer term result, but I've got to do so in a way that's responding. I've got to follow the response. And the response means I can get there more efficiently, more often than if I say, yeah, I feel like shit. I'm so blasted and so sore.
Yeah.
And then everyone cheers about how good that is. And you think, man, you can't train tomorrow. And now you miss volume. And if you miss volume, that's a risk factor for getting injured. So,
Greg, I need to pull something out of what you said there as well. You're talking about the adaptation side of it, and I think that's perhaps one of the biggest things that's been missing when people look at functional exercise. They do an exercise because of how it looks rather than the outcome it produces. And that's the adaptation you're talking about. So you need to look at what do you need, what result do you need to get, and then reverse engineer back from there. And that seems to me what you're talking about. It's not something I hear about so much in the industry. They just say the exercise is functional because of how it looks.
Yeah.
You're flipping that 180 degrees and saying the exercise is functional because of what it produces.
Yeah. It's like saying milk is functional not because it looks like muscle. No, milk is functional because it contains growth hormones and protein that builds muscle. So it's functional because of what it produces.
Yep.
So when we look at exercises that are almost circus-like in their nature, like standing on a balance beam and on top, or standing on a Swiss ball that's balanced on top of a balance beam, it's not functional because it looks like it's challenging. Because if that person falls off the Swiss ball, lands on the balance beam, and the beam hits them right smack between the groin, then that person's function's been decimated.
Rather inhibited.
Yeah. So when someone asks you why you're doing this exercise, you can say, because this makes you function better. What do you mean by that? It makes you more able to respond and then adapt to your environment, internal and external. And if someone said to me, prove it, you'd say, I'd love to. I'm going to do an evaluation now that reveals how well you function. And then I'm going to do a evaluation later that shows me that that's enhanced. And what I'm going to do in the middle is something that looks like neither of them, but it actually causes your nervous system to recalibrate so that you actually do that one that you did badly much better. And that's why we'd say this, which doesn't look like that, actually makes that better. And that's what we call functional.
The thing is, though, that you can measure that outcome anyway. So let's say we take a footballer that you were using before who's in the front row. If they hit a scrum and they were being pushed around before, and that stopped their team from being able to get the commanding position to determine the next steps in the game, so they were always reacting rather than setting up the play, you create that intervention because you've already got the outcome in mind, and then you can prove that player is no longer a weakness in that scrum. Then it doesn't matter if the exercises looked like something you do in a scrum or not. You've actually proven transfer and you've proven outcome. And that was one of the key points I really picked up from your talk, is that adaptation is what we're looking at. And here are the steps we're going to take to get there by both, as I said before, blasting the nervous system on one hand, but caressing it on the other hand.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up a video here in a moment. I'm going to share the screen because it's a great example of how many pundits would say, hey, to get that front rower to be better, to put us in a more commanding position, we've got to put some kilograms on his back squat and his bench press. And I would say, not necessarily. Let's give you a very clear example. Let's say the front rower is dropping his head forward in a flexion when he's in the scrum. The rest of your spine will go where your head goes and your eyes go.
Yeah.
So he's going to flex in his body and then he's going to continue to collapse. You're going to have a penalty awarded against him and then they'll lose their advantage or at least their middle ground. So if your coaching cue is to look up from your relatively flexed position, what you end up is with a head and neck that's in line with the rest of the spine, and you end up with a more stable trunk, so that your supposedly deficient lower body pushing strength might actually now be better because it's pushing against a rigid trunk, which maintains that body position. So it may be as simple as if you provide a cue that changes the control of the body, then the force that you have suddenly is applied through much more rigid lever and your outcome is better. And that's a response that happens instantaneously as opposed to an adaptation that took time to change. So I'm going to show a video, but keep talking while I do.
I'm going to give you a funny example, Greg. So one of my mates down here that I treat when I need to, He holds the record for the squat in Australia in the 105 kilo division.
Okay.
So his warm up is higher than my max. You know, he doesn't notice the weight of the bar until it's more than 200 kilos. He doesn't even notice it.
Yeah.
And we were talking one day, and I was talking to him about transfer of other skills, because basically he hit a stumbling point, and we just introduced some loaded carries for him, particularly unilateral ones.
Mm.
And I was saying to him, just give it a go. You got nothing to lose, and see if it transfers. And of course it did. And how I demonstrated it to him was, so you've got to understand this guy is so much physically stronger than me, it's just ridiculous. Okay. Mm. He's also a bit shorter than me, so we've got a center of gravity advantage as well. So we tied ourselves up in a wrestler's position. So collar tie is like a hand scooping around the neck, and we were using under and overhooks. If you don't understand wrestling, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
But I said to him, all I want you to do is move my 2 feet off this spot. That's all you have to do to win. Okay. He couldn't move me 1 inch.
Really?
And I said, okay, now I'm going to move you. So all you have to do is keep your feet planted where they are. And I could move him around wherever I wanted to.
Okay.
And that's sort of getting back to what Luis was talking about, how strong is strong enough.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the industry would say to that rugby player, add more kilos, add more strength, add more size. But I've taken a guy who has the record for the squat in his weight division in Australia. I can move him and he can't move me. And he is so much stronger than me. It would be embarrassing for me to get onto a squat rack next to him. But it's just about your motor control and how you're expressing that strength.
Yeah.
And so my outcome aims are very different to his outcome aims.
Yeah. Look, it's absolutely worth clarifying that, you know, there's probably the top 6 risk factors for being injured. The first one would be previous history, right, of being injured already. But that's not modifiable. Once you've been injured, you can't modify the fact that you've been injured.
Well, and you've got a new motor pattern, haven't you? And we know that once that motor pattern is there, it's not going to go away.
Yeah. So in those top 6, the first one is previous history, but it's not modifiable. So the next 5 are all modifiable. And some of those top 5 are the consequences of number 1. So you go, okay, well, you've been injured. We can't change that. You are at more risk, but I can modify some of the effects of what has happened by you being injured. And so the second one might be training load. So if you have a sudden increase in training load, it's a big risk factor for being injured. It doesn't mean that a high volume training load is a risk factor. No, not high volume. Sudden change in volume, okay, is a risk factor. So that's modifiable so that you can make progressive increments and periodize, etc. Then the other ones are pain. If you have pain currently, it's a risk factor for you then being injured. Some people have pain and they're not injured. Some people have pain and they are injured already. But irrespective of which one of those you are, if you have pain and you're not injured, you are now at risk of being injured.
We're still going to call that injured though, aren't we? Because it means that muscles or tissues are going to fire and sequence in unpredictable orders. So things that we can't predict the order of it. We can't predict how it's going to change the motor pattern. So I just call that injured myself. I do.
Correct. Yeah. So past history, training load, pain. Next one is mobility. There are some mobility literature papers that indicate that either below a certain amount of mobility, you are increased risk. And then another one that says if you have excessive and you cannot control it, then you are at increased risk. It's like an inverted parabola. Yeah, so you know, and if you've got too much, you're at risk, and if you don't have enough, you're at risk. And there's a happy medium. And that other end of the far end of the scale, which says that you've got too much mobility, leads into the next risk factor, which is that you can't control that mobility. And which is kind of what am I up to? Number 4, number 5, number 6. Number 6 is you can't control it. So number 5 is asymmetries. The presence of significant asymmetries, right? Everyone has a subtle variation between left and right. And there is some pretty good research that says that the cutoff points that are often recommended for people, like a limb symmetry difference of 10%. There's some recommendations that say that's way too big. It really needs to be 5% and under. And if you're running around with a 10% asymmetry between left and right side, or between quad and hamstring, then that's not really acceptable, because you're still at significant risk of injury. That shows up, that kind of limb symmetry difference shows up in some tests which are predictive of injury, right? Whereas if you've got less than 10%, like more like 5 to 3%, then that correlates with significantly better performance on some tests which are predictive of not injury. Right? Mm-hmm. So the last one being motor control. And I hear these people going tap, tap, tap on their keyboard thinking, I need to yell at Greg and say, strength. Why isn't strength in the top 6? And I'm going to go, whoa, calm the farm. Let me tell you what motor control is.
We could save time, Greg, and just say, go and check out Luis's talk. It's just wonderful for giving all of the evidence and all the stats on this.
Yeah. But when we say motor control, we're not thinking sort of airy-fairy stuff. It's control of your body's mobility. Now, when you don't have external forces on you except gravity, we're going to say that that's 1 times body weight. And many people that are on the ground or in quadruped or kneeling positions, because you've removed some of the body's weight, you're only kneeling on your knees, so there's the whole tibia and foot is no longer needing to be controlled. You're actually below body weight. So often people think of motor control exercises as being too low. And that's a reasonable, in fact, it's absolutely correct. When you're on the ground in quadruped and half and tall kneeling, you're probably only having to control parts of your body weight. And then you go to standing and it becomes 1 times body weight. So we have these 2 elements of motor control. One is, do you have enough minimum competency of control of your body? Mm-hmm. So we have motor control competency. And then we say, right, now that you've got minimum competency, can you continue to carry that control when the load gets even greater than your weight? And we would say, well, how much capacity do you have to control your body? And we call that motor control against high capacious loads, which as it's simplified is strength. So often people say, you're not including strength in there as a risk factor. And I say, well, I absolutely am. Motor control is competency and capacity, and you need to be strong. You need to tolerate high loads and withstand them and overcome them. So don't think that I haven't said strength is not important. I'm saying, no, motor control is a risk factor, but within motor control, you have a competency and you have a capacity, and you need strength to meet that capacity level. So our job is to judge people on their ability to have motor control against capacity. But that doesn't mean that you skip the other elements and just go and do strength training. Yeah. Often what you do is you address these other elements that are modifiable, and then you watch that motor control with capacity suddenly accelerate.
There's another point that has to be made, though, is that there comes a point where getting stronger is no longer more protective. And again, Luis covers this really well. So strength does reduce risk factors to a point, and once you get to a certain point, it's no longer something that protects you anymore. There's other things that actually give more bang for buck.
Yeah. Now have a look at this. I'm going to share a screen here and watch this little video.
Okay.
Okay. Now, we've got an athlete here who's an Australian footballer who is rehabilitating after an ankle injury, a high ankle sprain. He has a game coming up, I think, in about 4 days. It's a championship game. He's required. He's been through probably 2 weeks post-injury of management, and the management wasn't by me, although he did come to me for some advice, even though he was being managed by another clinician. We have a criteria I have a criteria that means that when I go back to the main coach who's asked me to check him out, I need this athlete to have ticked each box in sequence, so that if he fails to meet a criteria in his testing, then I know that if he doesn't meet the criteria here, if I take him to a higher level of testing, his risk of suffering an injury from the test is higher. So as it turns out, he's passed every single test so far. So I now decide to check what his force production is like in multiple planes, and not just force production, but energy storage and force absorption. So I want you to tell me what you think of his landing when he does this single hop for distance. Would you give that a tick that he is competent in his motor control when he landed on that?
I think that's a fairly obvious one.
Yeah, fairly obviously, no. So I often ask the question, so what do you think we should do with this guy? And the answer often comes back, actually the answer is not as common as this. No one has said he needs to do VMO training, right? That's a good thing.
Yeah, but that's because that's changed now, Greg. Now it's activate your glute.
Well, that was the thing.
It was VMO training. So you and I have been in this for a long time now. So we know it used to be VMO training. Then it was activate your transverse abdominis. And now we've gone to activate your glute.
Yeah, that's the number one answer, is he needs to do some glute med training. Okay. And you can have outliers of other statements, like he's got to do some core training and he should be in a Pilates program and he needs some orthotics and he needs a single leg box pistol training. In fact, he just needs to do some Bulgarian split squats and all sorts of things.
Yep.
So do him, all right, that's your answer. Let me show you what I did in 10 seconds.
Cool.
Guess what? He didn't get stronger. We didn't do any strength training at all. Now, obviously the heading in this slide is performance as a behavior we can change quickly. So what I did is I changed the output of his nervous system, and he demonstrates that he can control his body against gravity plus 2 or 3 times his body weight. That's the kind of ground reaction force that's going through his body when he lands. So you go, well, yeah, but I didn't make him stronger and I didn't do strength training. I did something which spoke to his nervous system that caused it to be changed its behavior so that when he landed, he had a different output. And someone measure that and say, well, he actually got stronger. Sure, his nervous system did something different.
That means his nervous system is able to express more strength. It doesn't mean the tissues didn't physically change in 10 seconds.
Correct. Let's look at the first one again and then we'll look at the second one just for fun. Not good enough. And let's look at the second one again. Left, yep. Left. All I said to him was, when you land, I'm going to throw a tennis ball at your face. So all of a sudden, as soon as he landed, hands were up, was ready to catch the ball. If I had have not cleared him for football based on that first hop test, I would have robbed his team of an athlete who has demonstrated symmetry, minimum levels of jumping ability, no pain, and he was fit. If I had done that based on his first land, I would have really made an idiot of myself. But
and
I know that
Greg, he in AFL football, he is going to catch a football right in front of his face, just as you were going to have him catch a tennis ball in front of his face, which I'm guessing that might be why you chose that test.
Well, also, there's a lot of science behind this. If he wants to know what his score is, so he's looking down on the tape. Yeah. And as soon as he looks down, he goes to cervical flexion.
Yeah.
As soon as you do cervical flexion, you do spine flexion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, spine flexion is often associated with more hip flexion, and hip flexion is often associated with more hip adduction.
Mm-hmm.
So what his body does is he collapses into valgus at the hip, and so he compensates by doing a big Trendelenburg, and his trunk leans over. And so what you see is him landing and then leaning all the way over.
Mm-hmm.
So all I had to do is to say, well, I don't have to tell him to think about his glutes. I just need to stop his eyes from going down to the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm using a constraint-based cue where I'm really interested in the primary landing distance,
Mm-hmm.
but he's got a landing fault. So what I'm going to do is give him a second task after he's done the first one. And so what he's got to think about is the second task. Then I've manipulated the constraints so that that second task facilitates the first one to be better.
Let's just have a talk about this idea of activating your glute as well. I want to ask you this question. If you get someone to consciously activate their glute and balance, can they? That's question number one. Now, a lot of people can do that. If we expect him to land in a football game, perhaps on one leg, just as you've demonstrated there, and he has to catch a ball, which is the cue you gave him, is it possible to think, catch the ball, make sure I activate my glute at the same time? And should we even be thinking about that? Of course not.
No. And why did we choose the glute instead of one of the other 849 muscles in the body? It's because the researchers decided to study the glute. I mean, why would you not study the plantaris? Why would you not study his extensor digitorum longus in his forearm? You know, because if you do extension of the wrist, it facilitates extension of the shoulder and the scapulothoracic joint. And then you've got extension of the spine, which facilitates anti-rotation. Yep. So there's all these things like, you know, could have said to him, when you land, I want you to do this with your hands. Well, that would have immediately caused him to go in extension. I just chose to use something that's he's more familiar with, which is to catch a ball, which forces your hands to do that anyway. So, you know, when you say one muscle, man, you missed out on the concept that there's 849 muscles involved in that landing technique, which is his whole organism. And if you don't think of muscles as being individual components, you just think of them as being pockets of an entire myofascial system, then you think this is ridiculous that we should be naming individual muscles. Look, and there's reasons why training individual isolated muscles is beneficial. The first one is if you're a bodybuilder and that's your industry or that's your desire, and that's perfectly reasonable and fine. We've all done that. Everyone loves a good set of biceps, right? But the second one is that there's some pain rehabilitation science that says that when you have sort of subacute or chronic pain, you get smudging of the homunculus. So what happens is that the neuronal connections in your cortex of your brain, so one nerve attaching to another nerve, that nerve connection becomes smudged. It means it's not as efficient.
Yeah, it's a weaker connection.
It's a weaker connection. And you want to be able to reset that. And so many elements of neurological rehabilitation post-injury are targeted towards improving that connection, because it's a nice theory that you should have a better connection. And you could argue why. I'm not even saying that's incorrect. But part of the ways to do that is to actively train a particular isolated part. And when you train it and you have an internal focus of thinking about that muscle and thinking about how hard you can squeeze that muscle, it strengthens the connection between the two neurons. And so this has spawned the industry that says that we should be doing an isolated muscle contraction. And that's the physical therapy industry, or physical therapies. And it's become a little bit of the bane of everybody else who trains function and movement, etc., and task specificity, for very good reason. But you don't have to throw that away, because you can do patterns-based.
That's exactly the point I was going to make. It's so easy to get someone to do a few reps of that so they know what they're trying to feel, and then work it into a pattern that involves multiple sequencing of switching on and off and relates to the function that they're trying to achieve in the first place. It's actually no extra effort for anyone to do that.
And in my other masterclass on alternative strategies for calf injuries, where I didn't do a single calf raise and I had to bring an athlete back in 12 days to a championship match, not a single calf raise was done. But I can guarantee you that we did wall drills for acceleration that included isometric and then
calf raise is inbuilt. It's inbuilt into the exercise.
So you could do patterns that effectively train the person that include stimulus to that injured body part, But it's even more than that. If you genuinely want cortical reorganization and you genuinely believe that this is a linchpin for full recovery, then you have this beautiful scientific method of motor control learning called augmented and intrinsic feedback that allows you to ask the person when they do a pattern. They do a pattern, you give them a cue. It's an external cue because that's more effective. Mm-hmm. And you say, so his external cue was look at the ball, catch the ball. I say it's external because the ball is an external object to him.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's an external reference point, effectively.
Yes.
As opposed to feel where your foot is on the ground, which is an internal reference point.
Correct. And then when the person completes the task, you then have permission to give them augmented feedback, which means I'm going to give you feedback that is on top of whatever you already feel. And my feedback is, you were successful, you caught the ball. All right, tick. You can then ask for intrinsic feedback, which says, can you tell me what you felt when you did that? So you tend to then draw the person's attention back into their body, and that strengthens the neuron connections of the motor cortex relative to their body. So if they said to you, I felt a lot of activity in my calf and foot, mm-hmm. At that point in time, you just sent a signal to the cortex that's responsible for sensation in the calf and the foot. And many people say, damn it, no, you still felt it in the glute.
Stop there. That's what I was going to say. It has to be in the glute. Stop.
No, it doesn't. Because maybe the foot and the calf, which got a great stimulus from this task, maybe that is what drives a better output in the glute.
I'm just going to give anyone watching this a bit of a hint right now. This works really well. Providing the external cue, getting the response you want, and then asking the person where they felt it, how they felt it. Sometimes it's like, what didn't you feel? Helps as well.
Yeah.
Be prepared for the fact that they won't understand what you're talking about, and it's going to take them some time to think about it. Mm-hmm. So if you ask someone that question, don't try and fill in the space. Just stand back and give them time to process it, because for many people, they've never thought about this in their life before. Do you find that as well, Greg?
Yeah. You know, you and I have done this in a group training where you stand 100 people up and you ask everyone to put their feet together, keep their arms relaxed by their side, and then turn their head and shoulders and pelvis around to the left as far as they can, keeping their feet still. And we have criteria that we would tick off in our brain that tells us that person has adequate mobility and control of it. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we could look at, in that 100 people, 30 of those people meet the criteria. Now, if we took those 30 people and we said to them, please raise your hand if, when you did that rotation, you felt a lot of activity in the area of your left lower rib cage or obliques. Okay, if you want to put a name to it, say obliques, right? And some people would put their hand up and they say, who felt it in the inside of the right groin? And some people would put their hand up. And who felt it in the left buttock? And some people would put their hand up. Who felt it in the right scapula as you spun around? And some would put their hand up. And you think, hang on a minute, how was 30 people who all did movement to the same criteria, how do they all feel it in different places? And the answer is that there's no way in hell should we say to those 30 people, if you don't feel it in your transverse abdominis and your quadratus femoris, then you're doing it wrong. So you can't train people to do a movement pattern by telling them which muscle they should feel it in. You can have a criteria about whether that pattern is inside your tolerance for variation, so your bandwidth. You can have that criteria. And then it's actually just interesting to hear where they tell you they feel it. It's not, but you shouldn't go the other way around and say you need to feel it in this muscle area.
Interesting and instructive, because then what you're saying then is, okay, so if you are then teaching someone a motor control skill and you talk about it where you feel it, that may have no relevance to them whatsoever.
Of course.
That's the real primary purpose behind it. So you're trying to find out how is this person perceiving it, so that you can then use their cues, not your own. You use cues that are useful to them rather than yourself.
And I think if we're going off maximum voluntary contraction research that says that this particular exercise produces this amount of EMG in a muscle. I've got to stop everyone in there and say EMG in a muscle is not reflective of that muscle functioning within a pattern. And the pattern is what matters. And here's the thing. If you were to do an external rotation of the glenohumeral joint, maximum voluntary contraction, and get a metric on kilograms or force or newtons or pound foot, whatever metric you want to use. And let's call it, just for relative sense, 100, all right? So the research might say that in the neutral shoulder position, you do an external rotation against resistance, and that's going to give you the highest EMG of any shoulder test.
Mm-hmm.
What if you then get a 24 kilogram kettlebell and you do a single-handed kettlebell, and as the bell swings between your legs,
mm-hmm.
your fist and your thumb faces towards the back. So you've got an internal rotation of that shoulder, and you've got a huge eccentric force as the bell swings underneath you.
Mm-hmm.
If you had an EMG on the infraspinatus at that point in time,
I reckon it'd be showing a fair bit.
I don't even reckon. I know for a fact that you've got significantly higher EMG.
Mm.
And in Lewis's masterclass, it's easy to understand why. Because you would be seeing on the eccentric component of that force velocity,
the force production curves, yeah,
which you don't get from a concentric contraction. So if you think the best way to train shoulder function is to do an isolated part in external rotation, and say, incorrect. Why wouldn't you do an entire body pattern that has so many cardiovascular benefits and pattern-based benefits and gives you a higher EMG in that injured part anyway?
Mm-hmm.
So
the other thing too is if you're truly trying to rehab a body part, and you use the standard that we use at the moment, which is restore range of motion, restore strength across the joint. Okay, it's a fairly standard way of looking at things right now. That still involves conscious competence.
Mm.
When you go to transfer and you go to actually using that injured body part in even everyday life, even if we don't go as far as performance, if we're not even putting those loads on, you have to be able to use it with unconscious competence. Mm. And unconscious competence only comes from pattern-based firing. It doesn't come from isolated muscle contraction.
Yeah. If I said
it can be a stepping stone, but it is only a stepping stone. If you don't take it that step further, you haven't reintegrated that injured body part into the person's system in a way that they can use automatically and at a moment's notice.
Absolutely correct. I mean, motor control or sequencing, to be able to move a body part requires 3 components in every general motor pattern. So a GMP is something that's pre-planned in the motor cortex, and it's sent out to the body. And those general motor patterns are established in the formative years of life, and they have 3 components, which is sequence, timing, and relative force distribution. What that means is that one muscle, so sequence means that this muscle will contract and then this one and then this one. Mm-hmm. Timing means that this muscle, which contracts first, contracts for an X period of time, and then after X period of time, the next one in sequence, it contracts for X plus 30%, mm-hmm. etc. And the next one contracts for a certain. So you can allocate a certain timing that's consistent with those general movement patterns. The last one is relative force distribution. So one of those muscles will contract the most, and others will contract with higher or lesser amounts mm-hmm. relative to the other ones. And then as you get stronger, the sequence timing and force distribution doesn't change. They just become upscaled. Right?
Yeah. In fact, Greg, if I remember correctly, you and I did a little chat when we were sitting in Japan waiting for a class to start, which is on the On Target Publications site. So we should put a little link in there so people will go and have a look at that talk. We deep dive into this a lot more and give a lot more practical examples of it.
Yeah, and the importance with this is that a GMP will happen if you give somebody an external cue that forces that GMP to occur. But what it won't do is there's absolutely zero chance that I could say to you, Rod, you should first contract your transverse abdominis, mm-hmm. and then at 16/100ths of a second later, you should contract your multifidus. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything more than 16/100ths of a second later, then we're going to call that a delayed firing. Yeah. And I want you to really work harder on making it closer to 16/100ths of a second mm-hmm. after the transverse abdominis. And then you can contract your hamstring mm-hmm. when you do a hip extension. okay, and your lumbar erector spinae, which is part
Yeah.
of your multifidus,
Yeah.
probably contract at the same time. Now, what you should do is have a 30% contraction of your TA and multifidus, but a much stronger contraction of your hamstring. First of all, you don't understand a thing that I'm saying, right?
Greg, honestly, I think in that case you underestimate me.
I think you probably could. But now do it while you're catching a football and landing.
Exactly. But I will say one thing, Greg. I will say one thing. If you are doing some individual muscle activations, by all means, prove to me it worked. That's all I want you to do. So give me the outcome measure that you're going to use for this athlete. So what performance outcome measure are you going to use for them? Show me that intervention and then just retest. Just show me that it worked. And if it worked, I'm happy with that. If you can show me the output, I'm okay with that. If it didn't work, then I'm going to ask you, what are you going to do next? And if you only have isolated muscle contractions available in your toolbox, you won't be able to produce the outcomes that athlete needs, or anyone in everyday life.
Correct. The key statement there is if you only have that.
Yeah.
Great bit of
I'm going to argue the key statement was retest.
Yeah. And have something that's valid, meaning it's got some contextual validity related to, or construct validity. So look at a research on fast bowlers in cricket that indicates that they're at more risk of a lower back injury if they have a Y balance test, a lower quarter Y balance test that's below the cut points, as described by the testing criteria. So in the pre-season, if you do a lower quarter Y balance test on fast bowlers in a cricket side and they're below the cut points, they're at an increased risk of getting a lower back injury that year. Now, much of our collective industry would talk about fast bowlers in cricket get stress fractures and they need lots of core training. Okay, now there's no doubt that you need to have motor control of your hip and pelvis when you do a lower quarter Y balance test. But if you did isolated training of the core in a myriad of different ways, and you said, I've ticked the box of doing core training for a cricketer.
Yep.
And I said, it appears you've done a lot of core training. Give you that. Do a Y balance test and tell me that person is not in the risk category. And if that transfer of core training doesn't occur, then you haven't reduced the risk.
Correct.
So it makes more sense to say, should I practice the lower quarter Y balance test? You go, well, you could. And if they got better at it, you've demonstrated a reduced risk.
And you're demonstrating their nervous system was able to learn.
Yeah.
You know, there's more than one ways of getting to this end point.
Yeah.
As you said before about that next key component was you have to have the different tools available. Yeah. And without the correct thinking behind it, I think it's very difficult to get the correct. I think it's hard to find a solution if you don't have the right questions in the first place.
Yeah, and when we bring it back to the topic of my discussion, which was recovery by supersets to caress the nervous system, so someone...
You probably should do that. That's a good idea.
Yeah, so they can come back to training more quickly.
Yeah.
This starts with the question that I have to answer.
What's too much? What's too little?
Well, from the head coach who says, Greg, can you prepare my athletes to do more power and speed training so that they can be better equipped for the rigors of a World Cup and an Olympic program?
Yep.
And I have to say yes, because if I say no, I don't have a job.
Yep.
If I say yes, I've got to prove it. If I want to prove it, I need my strength and conditioning coach to have availability of more athletes in the next session relative to this session. And that means that I have to influence the system and the program and the nervous system and the organism. I have to influence that to be more able to turn up for the next session. Because his training program for power and speed does have some minimum requirement for attendance. And if you don't attend, I can't get the stimulus in you to get the adaptation.
Sure.
But to turn up, you've got to respond in a favorable way. And that means I need to look at their high volume training and say, those exercises there are pushing you further towards being in trouble. And yes, they will eventually cause some adaptation. But you've got to turn up tomorrow. And if you can't turn up tomorrow because you're beaten up now, I lose my job. You lose your place in the side. If you lose your place in the side, it doesn't matter how good you're going to get in 6 weeks' time because you're not even in the team anymore. And in China, that's the cutthroat nature.
Yeah.
Stay in the team so that you can win and stay in the team so that you're broken. And you, physio, make sure that if they are broken, don't let them be any more broken. And if they're not, please don't let them get broken. And then I look at them and say, well, I'd love it if you could back off some of the training load that you've got on these athletes. And they look back at me and say, no chance. So then you say, how do I come up with high volume training that helps them? So,
and their rules are different for what they consider their key athletes compared to the others as well. Did I ever tell you when I was over in China doing an SFMA, I had an English guy turn up, great guy, that I'd met in Shanghai. And he was a physio for one of the soccer teams over there. And one of his other mates that I met was a strength and conditioning coach. And one of their key players blew out their ACL. And he says, when you have a key player, he says, everyone is in your tiny treatment room, you know, from the coach to the Communist Party official to the person who runs a sports university, everyone's there. And they're all looking at it and they go, is there any way you can make this heal faster? And he goes, well, which is what we've been talking about at other masterclasses. Tissue healing time is well known. He said, my job is going to be to support this athlete through that tissue healing process so they're ready to go when that occurs. And they said, this person's very important. We need them out there faster. And he said, can't change tissue healing times. Anyway, gets a call from his strength and conditioning coach. He goes, I won't use any names. He says, the athlete that you got that MRI on where we proved that there was a torn ACL, you didn't say that they could come out and do some training, did you? Oh, no, completely off training. We've managed to get their pain under control. We're now being able to start some exercises to support the system. And we're going to get this person into some other exercises to help with their energy system development, but without actually aggravating the knee. I thought you said that because the head coach has them out here now jogging around the track to see how much they can tolerate. And that pretty much sums up China to me.
Different rules. There's an advantage to learning those rules because they are pushing the limits. And
yeah, absolutely.
We both figured out what people can tolerate is much greater than China than what you can tolerate in other parts of the world. It doesn't necessarily make for an enhanced athletic output, but, you know, yeah, it's interesting.
Now, you did remind me of another question I had, Greg, an important one. So when we're doing the training where we're looking for tissue adaptation, so we're in that blasting side of the nervous system. So let's use a squat or a bench press as an example. We're doing strength training, we say long rest breaks between sets, and people will set something on the clock that they think works for them, and you know, we know that it can be fairly arbitrary. So what I'd like the listener to maybe get a bit of feedback from you about is, if we caress the nervous system, and you talked about different indicators to you that the person's nervous system is now recovered, can we use that as our indicator for when that person is ready to do the next heavy set rather than basing it on the clock?
Yes and no. Because your nervous system's output, such as in a lateral balance beam and walk, is an indication that it just doesn't have control of your body. Okay, and once it regains control of the body, you think this nervous system is ready to deliver again. So yes, that's part of it. There's other elements such as when you do max effort, prime mover exertion. Most of the max effort prime mover exertions are in the vicinity of less than 5 repetitions. Okay. You're looking at 3, 2, and 1 repetitions, particularly the above 95% of your 1 repetition maximum. You're going to be doing 1 and 2 repetitions, and they will take you maybe 8 seconds for a set.
Yeah, gotcha.
If you do two reps, you're quite likely to take about 4 seconds per repetition. And in some cases, it's a little longer because you've got a really long eccentric phase down, and then you're actually right on your limits. And so it's not particularly the most quick concentric.
No, totally understand.
And you may pause in between the next rep. So you're looking at 8 to 10 seconds perhaps, which happens to be the limit for the availability of creatine phosphate as a fuel.
Yes. Yeah. What I want to get into was a chemical substrate.
So beyond that, you're no longer relying on your most available ATP source. Now, that's why it's a max effort, because you can't get a third rep because you've lost your biggest fuel, and then you're into the fast glycolytic, and that's going to take too long. So apparently takes around about 4 to 5 minutes to replenish 95% of your creatine phosphate, which is why when you do a max effort bench press or back squat, your rest period is going to be in the vicinity of 4 or 5 minutes. And when you go back and do another max effort, bear in mind, you've only got 95% of that creatine left over. So instead of you getting through 2 reps, you might get through 1 3/4. And last quarter, you're really in trouble and you might be needing a spot. Then you take another 4 or 5 minutes and you're at 95% of the previous 95%. So there are times where we can rely on the nervous system to be an indicator of your readiness through some of these movement patterns and through some of these tasks. And there are other times where you say, irrespective of that, I still want to hang on a 5-minute rest period so I can maximize my creatine phosphate reserves.
So can I ask you another question then? Let's say, for example, you've got an exercise where you already know the baseline of what someone can do. They do that max effort. You've paid attention to the clock and you've said, okay, we're giving them that 4 or 5 seconds, but I can still see that their nervous system hasn't yet recovered. Would you keep on giving more low threshold stimulus to give the nervous system a chance to recover before you went and did another max effort? Or would you just go, the clock says 5 minutes, let's go again?
I'd go with the former, which is I would try to recalibrate the nervous system. I think there would be a great discussion and a great future observation for anyone who's going to be following this rule.
I want to make it clear, I don't know the answer. I'm genuinely asking the question if you've played around with that.
I think your 5 minutes could be better used rather than just sitting down. But I would be okay if somebody was to openly have a discussion and say, we think that passive rest is giving us enough recalibration of the nervous system compared to an active recovery. And there is some research that looks at passive rest versus active recovery, but it's related to clearance of lactate. And that if your lactic acid circulation or your concentration is high, it will naturally come down in 20 minutes. So when you really get on your lactic acid limit, you're going to take 20 minutes of just passive rest and it will come back down. Which means if you're in a rugby sevens tournament and you don't have another game for 30 minutes, you don't really need to do a great deal except just simply rest. But that doesn't but that's talking about recovery of biochemical markers. We're talking about a coordination of movement. So if you want to just sit down for 5 minutes and you feel like that's enough, I perfectly understand that. But we're talking about that doesn't necessarily guarantee that your coordination of body parts in a pattern has been recalibrated. So I would argue that many of these recovery biased supersets can be low enough that they don't stress the energy system. And in fact, they facilitate.
That's what I'm thinking. It basically is an indicator to you, excuse me, it's an indicator to you that the nervous system is now primed and ready for another max effort. Whereas without that indicator, it's just guesswork.
Sure. And it's easy to hypothesize the concept of these recovery biased supersets, which are multiplanar, they control in multiple directions. They involve, a deep diaphragmatic breathing. There's a lot of hypothetical indications that that's going to support the flushing out of biochemical markers. And it's going to support the lymphatic system and all the benefits that has for clearing out, unwanted substrates from exercise, as well as just re-coordinating the different anatomy trains and fascial slings that should be coordinated in multi-directional movements to support the next single plane effort that you're going to do. I don't think there's anything to be lost by doing recovery biased supersets at a bare minimum compared to just sitting down. I think there's a great deal to be gained by doing them. And I think that they could be substituted, or they could be a great substitution for a second or a third blasting superset. I'm actually a big fan of doing those primary strength exercises, or having, when I work alongside a strength coach and I'm their support staff, I'm a big fan of that strength coach diving headlong into primary strength training and then post-activation potential as the second or as the first superset. So you do a big bench press real heavy and then you stand up and throw a med ball toss.
Yep.
That's your first superset.
Yep.
That just makes perfect sense to me. Or you get up off the bench and then you go and do a standing broad jump, for example, or after a deadlift. But I think you've got an opportunity on your the second superset, which is the third one.
Yep.
I think you've got a great opportunity to then say, okay, we've just blasted that nervous system, now recalibrate it so we can do that again. I think that's a missed opportunity.
In a sport where, you could take volleyball, for example, where you do have that explosiveness, then there is a relative rest in play. Even if it's just waiting for the other guys to do their three picks before they go, you've got that time where you are more or less actively recovering. And if you're able to position and move, and your nervous system is used to that because of your training routine, I wonder about the transfer of that as well, rather than just doing your one superset and then doing nothing else.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if there's research on that. I'm just wondering if that is closer to game conditions and therefore you're more likely to get some transfer.
Even if there's not research on it, it doesn't mean that it's not effective. It just means that it hasn't been done.
This hasn't been looked at yet. I would argue if you were training someone in that third set that you were talking about, trying to caress their nervous system and just getting them consciously aware of the fact that if they can get their breathing under control, then their nervous system is actually more primed to go again. If you can get that to transfer over into a sport, but this has been done in martial arts for centuries. I mean, this isn't modern at all. If you can get someone to concentrate on their breathing during a relative period of rest, you're ready to go again.
Yeah, Lewis deliberately.
More speed.
Yeah. I mean, Lewis deliberately talked about 3 benefits of strength training being sports performance, injury risk reduction, and fatigue management. And that fatigue management, you say, well, can you do strength training and can it change your fatigue tolerance? And the answer would be that you probably can, because if you've got a higher maximum force, then your relative lower percentages can occur much easier for you. And if it's much easier, you don't get so fatigued. So
it's out of you effectively.
Great transfer there. But that fatigue management is super important for, you can also get reduced fatigue issues if you've got an enhanced recovery strategy. And if your nervous system's actually better at doing so. So I think the strongest research on sports performance is that if you score more points than the opposition, you win. It's a no-brainer. So when we think we're supportive of sports performance, we go, sure, but what about the fat, slow person who's just better skilled? They're still going to win championships. And you go, absolutely correct. That's all that matters. But when someone's in high volume training, because that's the decision that everybody makes to say we think it's valuable, then you need to make that person stay in high volume training. And that means recovery is super important. You don't have to wait until it's time to go to sleep or it's time to eat to get your recovery. You can do it in between your supersets. So that's the important point from this masterclass. And if no one believes me, that's okay. I think we proved it pretty comfortably across multiple sports in China that it's very doable, and we had great success. And we could ask the question, would they have had success without that strategy? We'll never know. So probably not.
No worries, Greg. I'm just going back through some of my questions to see if there isn't anything we've covered. Okay. Oh, look, I'm just going to point something out, Greg. At one point when you were on that, the makeshift balance beam with the half foam rollers, and you said, "Good job, me." Can I just point out that you were eaten by crocodiles 3 times before that? Yeah. But on the flip side, I would like to point out that on the battle rope, the young fella was no match for you.
Correct. And the good job, me, was the use of augmented feedback. It's important that you whether it's talking to me or whether it's talking to somebody else, you've got to have that very clear understanding about what it means to have a successful completion of the task. Because if you don't have a successful completion of the task, isn't that right, Lola? Then you've lost your waypoint about whether you're headed in the right direction. So, I was eaten by a crocodile many times. And that's part of the external cues, is to create a consequence of non-success. Because it's not really failure, because you only fail when you stop trying.
And look, we may have beaten this to death already, but that consequence of failure has to be something that the person understands when they're not with you. So there's no point you as a coach teaching this sort of motor control retraining and saying that was not successful. They have to be able to judge for themselves whether it was successful or not, because you need them to do that when they're away from you.
I had a client the other day who was doing some kettlebell swings with, and he likes to, at the top of the kettlebell swing, keep his chin on his chest. So he kind of gets into a nice neck and spine alignment when he's on his way down and through.
Mm-hmm.
When he comes to the very top, he's got a big cervical flexion. He likes to keep his chin on his chest.
Yep.
We could hypothesize about why that's the case, and it's not really that important. But my cue is that I want that ability to co-contract, so that I want him to be more not jammed in a flexion. I want him to be somewhere in the middle. Okay.
Yep.
And so my cue to him was to write on a piece of paper the words, "There is a beast on the other side of the room," and I drew some big beast eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And this beast doesn't think you can do it. I want you to look the beast in the eye and say, "Not today. Not on my watch do you beat me." So when you get to the top of the kettlebell swing, I want you to look the beast in the eye and give it a little nod. "I've got you."
Mm-hmm.
And that external cue is meaningful to him because it's both reassuring that he's actually doing really well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also that competitive streak of, I want to beat this imaginary beast who's looking at me saying, "You're not very good at this."
Mm-hmm.
I want to look him in the eye and say, "Nope, I got this." So I think you've got to look at something which taps into that person's desire and what taps into their emotion. And I've spoken about this in other masterclasses, the need to have an understanding of Chip and Dan Heath's book called Switch, which is how to affect change.
Great book.
Great book.
Interestingly enough, you and I had both read that before we'd even met. Both read it individually.
And it just tells us about the importance of cueing the emotions and shaping the path to get a change. And sometimes we can spend too much time spending at the intellectual level and the academic part of the brain. And other times you can bypass that completely, subconscious competence, by using emotions and shaping the path to get an outcome. Yep. And in China, no more than anywhere else in the world, because many of the individuals, because I don't speak Chinese enough and they don't speak English enough, I cannot communicate with them from an educative point of view about the importance or the reasons behind a particular strategy. I can't do that. So I need to get out of the academic supertentorial benefits of coaching. To tap into their emotions is difficult because most of them don't have a choice about being in that environment.
Yeah.
They did not choose to be an athlete.
And you've always said they're just emotionally so tired as well. You know, rehab for them is a nice rest.
Sure it is, yeah. So I can't tap into their emotions of, some of them have competitive desires, but that typically only happens when you turn it into fun.
Yeah.
And so that turning something into fun is really shaping the path. It's giving them no choice but to get the result that you want by creating circumstances where they have no choice but to behave in this particular way. Now, China has done that en masse by controlling their population and giving them no choice but to behave in a particular way. But that really affects their ability to learn and respond and adapt when it comes to variation in their sport, which is why they don't do so well in many team sports. They do well in individual technical elements, but less so in the team sports where there's so much variation, and that motor control and adaptation and response is just not as good as it is in more organic countries like, say, Brazil and soccer. So, yeah.
Well, I think we could both agree that cerebral side of things is actually way less important than the other two. Like, we've got that phrase everyone uses, that knowledge is power. That is not true. You know, knowledge is only power when it's coupled with applied action.
It's called wisdom. Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it sits up here. It makes no difference at all if something isn't being done with it.
Yeah, knowledge and experience together gives you wisdom. So, and there's a great saying that's probably been misquoted as to who it comes from, but One of them is Benjamin Franklin, and he probably stole it from a Buddha. But it was that tell me and I'll forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I will learn.
Yeah.
So that really speaks to the 3 tiers of the Chip and Dan Heath book. If you tell me at the supertentorial level, I'm going to forget it because there's no connection with that knowledge to how I behave. If you show me, I might remember because now I'm starting to get rather than a cognitive awareness, I'm now getting a sensory awareness through vision. All right. So I might remember that, but it's only when you involve me, that's when I will learn because it's a full body organism circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole thing about knowledge is power and education is we've got to tell all of our clients why we're doing things. I really, for the large part, think that that's not necessarily correct. I think the person's got to walk out of your space better than they walked in. And yes, you need to hook them and you need to shape the path and tap into their emotions. But you can't tell somebody to be emotionally connected to what you're going to ask them to do. You can't force somebody. It has to be the creation of an environment, much like Scott Hobson was saying. We are agents for change, agents for transformation. We create an environment where that's possible. But you don't do that by telling somebody to be happy or telling somebody to be motivated. I can't give you that motivation, but I can create an environment where that motivation will come from you. And if I can't, I just need to be better.
You've heard me say many times that my best treatment on my best day is no match for someone's crappy environment and habits.
Yep.
No match.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how skilled I am, how much knowledge I have. If I can't help someone change their habits and change their environment, I can't have an impact.
It speaks to two other masters. Lewis Mosquito mentioned it, and I'm sure, got that from Gray Cook, which is remove the negative first.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we can put all these things in, these great things in, but there's a negative that you've got to take away that allows you to actually be open to change.
That's already in capital letters on one of my slides, Greg.
Oh, is it? Good. Well, we'll look forward to seeing that.
Well, I mean, from your point of view, it'll be nothing that, you and I haven't discussed 1,000 times before.
No, of course it will. It'll be it's going to be wrapped up in some nice ribbons, and that's what we want to see because those packages are important for sure.
Well, I would argue, and we've talked about this as being some of the weaknesses that we've seen, or let's say the missing gaps that we've seen in clinicians over the years, is that if you don't have this particular system of thinking, you're not going to get the results because you don't know where to start.
Yeah.
And particularly watching some of these masterclasses, I've actually noticed that everyone's doing it. They just have a different organization in their head. So I'm going to show one organization, then I'm going to actually show your organization, the one that you use. I'm going to show how they interrelate to each other. And I've got a slide in there where I've put all of my buckets in a row, and every time one of the presenters has mentioned that bucket. And the slide is almost overwhelmingly confusing because there's just so many arrows and names and everything on there, but that's actually what I want. I want to show that something simple is being used by everyone. And you can just make it a system. You take what I'm going to show you, you make it your own system. And as long as it covers all the elements, that's all that matters.
There's a mind map that I created, which was what do all the great people that I've met around the world do. Mm-hmm. And I took all their organizational flowcharts, their missions, their statements, their principles, and I created a mind map. And then I put another mind map next to it with all of its different missions and how they went about doing so. And when I lined them up against each other, like you've just said, they all contain 4 or 5 main buckets. And they slightly different orders or slightly variations in how they're called. The words are different.
Yep.
But when you come up with a word that actually encompasses both of the two, which is the same thing, you think, holy shit. These people they're not competing with each other and they're masters of our industry.
They've often never met each other.
And they're doing the same things, and it actually happens to be only 4 or 5 great things. So look forward to seeing that package for sure.
Okay, I guess we'll call this a day, will we? How long have we been carrying on for?
Waffling for way too long, I'm sure.
We'll have to edit this down somewhat then.
No, leave it untouched. Lola's the best bit.
Oh, we'll put Lola in there for sure.
All right, I'm going to press stop now, and we'll see you in the next masterclass.
Okay.